from Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's today's lineup. K-State's Glynn Tonsor with this week's cattle market segment. He'll talk about the crossover price support from the hog market that appears to be waning, and he'll discuss the economic considerations of making the switch from spring calving to fall calving. Also today, K-State's Jaymelynn Farney looks at the possible livestock toxicity problems associated with several cover crops. She urges you producers to be fully aware of those issues before planting cover crops for grazing. And on this week's 4-H segment, Jeff Wickman talks with K-State's Beth Hinshaw about the True Leaders in Service initiative, which begins today and runs through the month. All this and more right here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You are listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. As always, glad to have you aboard. And first up for you, the cattle market analysis and comment provided this time by livestock economist Glynn Tonsor of K-State Research and Extension. Well, Glynn, we're coming off of a trading week which hardly shined for producers. There was a definite negative tone.
Yeah, we definitely had a pullback this week, and I think there's several parts to that. When you look at the cash trade, fed cattle 5 market, we were off about $2.50 from the prior week. Feeder cattle in Salina, AMS called it flat to $5 up, but the majority of the lots would be flat or actually, maybe $1 up. A couple specifics there. The lighter weight lot, 125 head, weighing 488, came in at 182. A little bit heavier, 718-pound lot, came in at 156. And then the biggest lot that actually transpired was 865 pounders, over 500 head, traded at 135. As you bounce around the country, I would call it actually flat, not flat to $5 up. I think Salina was a little unique. The parallel from the board, April feeder cattle closed Friday at about 145.5. That's down a full $3 from last Friday. April live cattle was 126 and a little over a half on Friday. That was also down about $3 for the week. Specific to the live cattle at least, and maybe some spillover to feeder cattle trading, there was a slightly bearish tone in the cattle on feed report. Lee Schultz talked about that. Those February placements being a little bit higher as part of that. So that part isn't surprising. We had a little pullback. I honestly think a little bit of it was a reaction that followed the lean hog movement this week, and I'm guessing that Lee talked about that last week as well. But for quick context, the June lean hog contract on the first day of this month was $75. We peaked on the 25th at $97, and we closed on Friday at $88.5.
The definition of volatility.
It was a lot of volatility. Yeah. And there's lots of reasons for that. We're not going to belabor here. But this past week and the week before, I think the cattle complex was being impacted by the pork complex. 2 weeks ago, that was supportive for the cattle market. This most recent week, I think it was one of the pull downs. There's lots of uncertainty about whether or not we're going to export more to China and if ASF is going to lead to that and so forth. We're probably far from done with volatility there. But I do think one of the reasons that we had a pullback on the live cattle markets was we didn't have the pork side support this past week.
And the trade didn't get much support from the cutout market this past week either.
No, although it didn't move as much as live animals did. So choice came in at $227.5. That's down about $1.50 from the prior Friday. And select was $219.5, which is actually up about $1 from the prior week. So, wholesale meat moved some. Select was up a little, which is a good. That part of the story is good, but it's also good that meat didn't move quite as hard as live cattle.
Let's talk a few moments, Glynn, about a report which came out just a little over a week ago. Haven't touched upon it yet, the USDA's cold storage report, and looking at competing meats as well as beef. What revelations, if any, resulted from those numbers?
Yeah, the summary there would be is beef stocks are up 4% from the same month a year before, pork up 1%, and chickens down 3%. The reason I highlight that is I hope all our listeners now know we have a lot of meat being produced in this country, so monitoring its ongoing movement, that it's not stacking up, is important, and this cold storage report is useful for that. The beef number being up by 4% has been interpreted both good and bad, depending on what media you would read. It might simply be that the private trade is stacking up beef in advance of spring run, so that has happened before, but it's worth monitoring. Anytime you have a notable increase, and 4% is a pretty big number on the millions of pounds we're talking about here, I have my eye on that to make sure that we're not slowing down on the demand front. That's the reason I'm bringing it up. It's quite possible that's embedded in some of the slowdown this past week in the cattle trade. So I mainly at this point think it's worth monitoring. 1 month's change there isn't enough to overreact to, but if we started getting multiple months of stacking up cold storage volumes, that would not be a good sign, because it would be a sort of preliminary signal that demand is softening, and that would be an issue.
Bears monitoring for sure.
Yep.
Want to spend the rest of our time talking about a few things correlating to the difficulties of this past winter on cow-calf producers in particular here, which is potentially a market influence as we go on down the line, we'll see. First of all, you want to remind producers about the support the USDA can provide in the case of livestock losses in general, and calves would fall under that category. The Livestock Indemnity Program, producers should be alert to the opportunity there.
Yes, and this is actually not unique to beef cattle, so other species as well. And, our listeners are outside the state of Kansas for this broadcast as well, so there's multiple reasons I want to do this. But specifically, the Livestock Indemnity Program is available for those that have experienced loss. The Farm Service Agency is actually who that program's operated through, and I encourage folks to contact their local FSA. There is a December 2018 fact sheet on the web, so if you go to USDA FSA and just literally type in Livestock Indemnity Program, that's probably what will come up, and it walks you through the details of this. And I'm not going to read that for all our listeners here. I want to call our attention to it, but there is one specific thing that I want to use as an encouragement for people to go soon, if it's relevant, is, there's verbiage in this fact sheet that's part of the law, is an owner or contract grower, most of our listeners would be owners for this, must file notice within 30 calendar days of the event to be eligible for payment. Some of the events we're talking about are been more than 30 days, some are more recent. So if you're listening and if you've experienced a loss that's probably in this case tied to flood or related issues, I encourage you to track down that fact sheet and see if it applies to you. Even if it doesn't, a really good practice would be to document the loss. So if you've had a veterinarian involved or anything like that where you've experienced more mortality or morbidity and you have some kind of third-party documentation of that, that would help you in getting these payments. I'm not an expert on the process beyond that. I'll leave that to FSA, but I do want to take this opportunity to kind of highlight the need for that if it applies to our listeners.
And again, you can go to this web address, fsa.usda.gov, and look for the Livestock Indemnity Program details, or strike up that conversation with your local FSA personnel as well on that. Now, in light of the calving troubles brought on by the extended winter conditions, and those with herds calving right in the midst of that really struggled, there were considerable calf losses. You say you're getting questions now from producers about the economic plausibility of switching from a spring calving herd to a fall calving herd. And there are several moving parts you want producers to be aware of here, Glynn.
I do, and I'll start by saying those moving parts warrant a more full assessment. We're about to initiate a study related to this, but I don't have that to speak to. So the best I can do is be an economist to speak to what I think is most important to get people thinking through this. And first and foremost is changing something as important as when you calve probably should not be a reaction to 1 year. I know that's tempting because we have had a rough winter, and I know some people have had notable challenges, so I'm not trying to dismiss those, but there's a lot involved in changing from spring versus fall calving seasons, so I would encourage you to take a longer-term view on that, first and foremost. The other part would be the profitability impacts of that, not just a ease of calving and so forth, but just the cold, hard economist profit aspects, is one of the appeals of switching is probably getting a higher price for your calves. So if you can avoid selling in September through November and sell in the spring, historically that comes with a higher calf price. So that's the carrot, if you like, in this change. But most of our listeners that have done some homework know you also tend to have higher cost per cow. So you usually have to procure more feedstuffs. So there's a trade-off there between likely higher revenue but almost certainly higher cost that come with that. And each operation is going to differ on the net of those two. The other thing that I want to highlight here is I'm getting this discussion quite a bit. And in the event we are having more people switch, which I don't know if that's the case or not, but there are some serious discussions going on. At some point, markets react to that. And the reason that's really important for this is, if you've heard me out a little, is there might be a revenue benefit from this shift. Well, that revenue benefit will disappear if we have many people change, because effectively you'll change seasonality in the feeder cattle market if we start putting more of our calf crop out in the spring instead of the fall. As you make that shift, I would anticipate the market would adjust. It doesn't if one producer makes a change, but collectively we move a lot ahead. And that very quickly would change it from being a good, profitable decision for somebody, an early adopter that might make sense, to somebody later in that story, think 2-3 years later after some of these changes have already occurred, it may no longer make sense. So I know there's a lot of econ jargon in that, but markets do respond to changes, and you'd be changing the timing of calf crop supply in our industry as we shift the calf timing. And that's important to note, because it would change what you put in your calculator for, am I going to get this bump on revenue or not? Stated differently, if you don't get a bump in revenue and you know you get higher cost, it's probably not a good thing to change. So it's a word of caution. I'm not telling anybody not to change, but I'm basically encouraging them to sharpen their pencil more than once when they're assessing it.
It's a long-term commitment. It's not something that you flip-flop every year, every other year. So you have to put it in that context as you analyze that.
Very much so. To muddy up the waters, pun intended, because it's a reaction to mud here, right. There is discussion about, rather than fully changing, what if I take half my herd and become fall and half spring? The pros and cons of that are long. The pros are you're splitting some of your most limited resources. A bull's very expensive for the amount of time we use them. So if you can use them 2 times a year instead of 1, that's good. Likewise, labor is a challenge throughout all of ag. If you can kind of stretch 100 cows, 2 groups of 50 or however you want to talk about this, that's probably easier on the labor front. So those are some of the pros. The downside is you have twice as many exposures to bad weather. If you're also in the row crop business, you probably have more complications on enterprises and competing use of your time and so forth. So that is not a no-brainer either. But it doesn't have to be a full switch from one to the other is the reason I bring it up. For some people, it might make sense to diversify and just split the timing. That warrants assessment as well.
Think through all of the management variables involved in that kind of decision for sure. Glynn, good input as always. Hey, thanks for coming over.
Thanks for having me on here.
Providing this week's insight on the cattle markets and associated topics, Glynn Tonsor, livestock economist with K-State Research and Extension. We'll return with more after this. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today continues now. These next few moments are directly to those of you with an interest in cover crops for grazing purposes. Now, there's such a broad array of cover crop options out there. Some of those may be great for grazing. Some of those might have some limitations and even restrictions in that respect. Jaymelynn Farney joining us. She's a beef systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension, based in southeast Kansas, and she devotes a large amount of her time to cover crop productivity for grazing resources. There's such enthusiasm over cover crops, Jaymelynn, and what they can do for livestock producers in a grazing sense, but there are some aspects of these that folks need to be aware of at the same time, right?
That is correct, Eric. Unfortunately, just due to the nature of the plant growth physiology, they're very rapid growth. To be rapid growth, they accumulate a lot of nitrates, which we all know about nitrate issues. And, for those of you who follow a lot of popular press, I've heard the horror stories coming out of Missouri of a bunch of cattle consuming high nitrate sorghum sedans and killing a bunch of them. So here's my pre-warning already. If you're feeding any sorghum sedan type of hays, pearl millets, please test them for nitrate prior to feeding to your cattle. $15 test can save you a lot of money in the long run.
That's one example of several toxicity potentials that you want folks to know about. Sorghum sedans, they've been around for a while. Folks are familiar with those. There are others, though, that can be toxic as well, one of which is hairy vetch. Talk about that.
Yes. Really, for a bunch of what we're going to talk about for these metabolic disorders, we can manage for most of them.
Okay.
However, hairy vetch is one of them that we cannot manage for. For one thing, it's actually listed on the USDA's Poisonous Plants Registry for Livestock.
That ought to be a red flag right there.
That is a red flag. Hairy vetch is one of the best cover crops in the state of Kansas, pretty much the only one we've found that can grow as a fall legume. The rest of our fall legumes just don't do very well. However, from a cattle perspective, it is the one that is truly a toxic plant. You visit with your veterinarian and they get very worried. Now, the thing that concerns me the most about hairy vetch is we still don't know what the direct toxin is that causes issues with the cattle. Symptoms are very clear when you know you have a hairy vetch toxicosis. Those calves kind of have an allergic reaction. They get some nasty-looking scales around their neck. It impedes breathing rates, eventually gets into their kidneys, and the greatest cause of death is due to kidney malfunction. When calves start showing symptoms of hairy vetch toxicosis, that kind of rash-looking deal, it's 50 to 100% lethal.
Wow. It's risky, no matter how you slice it with this particular cover crop.
It is very risky.
There are other options out there.
Yes, there's other options.
There are the crops known as lupins, and several of them. Jaymelynn, in a write-up on this particular topic, you note that some are very suitable as grazing fodder, and some not so much.
Yes, and that's where an open dialogue with your seed supplier is very important for the lupins. There's 4 non-toxic species, and I'm not going to list them all just due to time.
Right.
Please visit your local extension office and get the publication Forage Crops Grazing Management, and it'll give you the list of the 6 lupin species that are toxic to cattle and sheep. And when those plants cause issues, they actually have cleft palates, crooked legs, distorted and malformed spines, and birth defects, especially if a pregnant cow consumes those type of lupins.
So dramatic ill effects when grazing the wrong type of lupin. The others are perfectly suitable.
Yes.
So you need to make that distinction and refer to that publication. Brassicas, now, they may not be fully toxic, and in fact, there are quite a few brassicas planted out there for grazing purposes, but you say, Jaymelynn, that some of those could lead to certain metabolic disorders.
And I actually kind of have a love-hate relationship with the brassicas because they are a tremendously high-quality, fast growth, really put out a lot of tonnage forage. However, some of the things that are negatives about the brassicas, and when we say brassica, to specify, that's your kale, your rapeseed, swede, turnip, canola, mustards, radish. They're very high moisture and low fiber, and anybody who's ever grazed them would know that. You don't ever walk behind cows grazing a field of turnips. It's pretty rapid passage rate. But also, because they're high in sulfur, you potentially could lead to polioencephalomalacia, or PEM. We hear more about it in feedlots, but it's a potential issue with your brassicas because they're high sulfur. But what's even more concerning possibly to me is the glucosinolate. That's a big, long, fancy chemical word. The glucosinolate is great from the cover crop perspective to help with insect control, the fumigation. However, for cattle, it actually ties up important minerals, zinc, copper, manganese, iodine, all of which are important for reproduction, immune health, hoof care. So you have to be thinking about that. So luckily, like I said, this is one of those metabolic disorders you can manage for. Just dilute the amount of brassicas available for the cattle. 75% of their diet is the maximum amount you need for brassicas.
So this can be managed then?
This can be managed.
Small grains, wheat, barley, oats, can be considered cover crops, can be thought of as grazing resources if managed carefully once again.
Yes, and, of course, the very first thing you always think about from your metabolic disorder is bloat. Very easy to manage for. Put out some bloat mitigation strategies such as ionophores or your bloat guard. Provide them a dry source of something else. Those can help you manage for bloat. But also, and we often forget this until you have the issue, those early lactation cows on those small grains, they will have grass tetany. So make sure you have a very palatable magnesium source for those cows. If you're going with just a straight mag-ox or magnesium oxide form of magnesium in your mineral, it needs to be between 8 to 12% magnesium to be able to reduce the amount of grass tetany potential.
That's free choice, of course.
That's free choice.
Right. Legumes, well, you mentioned bloat with the small grains. Same notation with legumes if one isn't careful with their grazing.
Correct. Once again, another kind of rule of thumb, keep about 50% of the diet or less of legumes in grazing, and you'll get along without having as many bloat concerns. Now, luckily, there are some types of legumes that are less bloat potential than others. Alfalfa is one of the highest bloat potential, whereas annual lespedeza, bird's foot trefoil, and sainfoin are non-bloating legumes that you have out there. Your clovers are kind of intermediate.
And then you can look at any number of other possibilities that fall under the legume category. Cowpeas, mung beans, even soybeans. Are they safe candidates for grazing as well?
They are. Once again, we're just really getting into a lot more research and data at the safety and cattle performance. Sheep have been grazing these type of legumes, the cowpea, lab, sun hemp, for many years. And bloat is a concern with them as well, but not near to the issue as our lush green alfalfa.
It comes back to wise cover crop selection and good management to go along with that. Leave folks with this, and you referred to it earlier. K-State has put together a very fine publication on cover crops for grazing purposes that folks should access. Much more detail and important detail that the producer should have a look at before they commit to planting one of these cover crops for forage.
Yes, and we have 2 other free tools available for you. This publication that we're talking about, it's an 8-page publication, but you can find it on our mobile apps. We have in both Android and the Apple Store. You can download the app. It's Potentially Toxic Crops for Livestock. Another thing is, if you're looking for both timing of planting as well as grazing quality of different cover crops, you can go to a free online tool, the Midwest Cover Crop Council Decision Tool. Myself and several colleagues here from Kansas, we've developed a Kansas-specific module. You pick Kansas, pick your county, you can put your crop rotations in there, and you can pick 3 goals that you want your cover crop to accomplish. And it will generate a list of all of the available cover crops that will meet your goals and give you estimated planting dates.
All of those are great resources, but that decision tool especially so. And you can get at that simply by searching for Midwest Cover Crop Decision Tool. Take full advantage of that. Jaymelynn, thanks for covering this material with us today. We appreciate your time.
Anytime, Eric.
Beef Systems Specialist Jaymelynn Farney, K-State Research and Extension. Do take advantage of the informational and educational materials that K-State provides that can help you arrive at good decisions on cover crop selection. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll return shortly with more on the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson here, and now on to today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, prices, trade news, stock levels, and other factors influenced farmer responses to the USDA's Planting Intentions Survey that was taken early in March, and the results were released last Friday. Here's a closer look from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
USDA's report on farmers' planting intentions shows a lot more potential corn acreage than many had expected, 4% increase from last year. Farmers indicated they would plant fewer soybeans than expected, down 5%. USDA's chief economist Rob Johansson says farmers were surveyed back in late February to mid-March, and he says they were simply answering the survey following the market signals at the time.
Discussions about deal with China, for example, and market movement, so we'd seen some positive movement in corn prices.
And a look at USDA's new grain stocks report gives some other good clues.
We've been doing a pretty good job on selling corn, so we see stock levels for corn at 8.6 billion bushels. That's 11% lower year over year.
On the other hand, soybean stocks March 1st, huge.
2.72 billion bushels, up 28% year over year. Record overall stocks, off-farm and on-farm, both records.
Let's throw sorghum into this. Stocks are up 37% above a year ago. On-farm stocks up 89%, so it's no wonder farmers expect to plant record low acreage to that crop. Taking a look at the numbers for wheat.
Both the spring wheat and the durum wheat numbers could show a little interest in the markets today.
Might raise some eyebrows. Farmers' planting intentions show cuts in wheat acreage more than some analysts had expected. All wheat area estimated at 45.8 million acres, down 4% from a year ago, the lowest wheat acreage in at least 100 years. But the numbers that surprised some people included
other spring wheat acres down 3% year over year, second low on record, down to 12.8 million. Durum expected to be down 1.4 million acres. That's down 31% year over year.
And far below trade expectations. We know how much winter wheat is out there, 31.5 million acres, down 3% from last year, the lowest since 1909 when records began. U.S. wheat facing a lot of competition on world markets right now, seems to be not price competitive. Meanwhile, wheat stocks are up 6% from a year ago. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
As for 2019 prospective plantings here in the state of Kansas, corn growers here intending to plant 5.7 million acres. That would be up 5% from last year. Soybean planted acreage in Kansas expected to be 4.95 million acres, up 4% from last year. Grain sorghum in Kansas, 2.75 million acres. That would be down 2% from a year ago. Other crops, sunflower producers expecting to plant 60,000 acres, up 13% from 2018. Canola planted acreage at 29,000 acres, down 38% from 2018. And cotton producers expect to plant 170,000 acres this year. That would be up 3% from a year ago and a record high if realized. Attention this week will be on the U.S.-China trade talks to take place in Washington. The sessions this week come after U.S. officials were in Beijing for talks last week. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin met with China officials then, headed by Vice Premier Liu He. The two parties continued to make progress during what were called candid and constructive discussions on the negotiations and important next steps. That, according to a statement out of the White House. Chinese Commerce Ministry spokesperson Zhao Feng told reporters last week that while some progress had been made, much work remains to be accomplished. National Economic Council Director Larry Kudlow said last week that the Trump administration was prepared to stretch the talks with China for months, and Washington was in no rush to resolve the problems. He said this is not time-dependent, as he made a presentation in Washington. Kudlow went on to say this is policy and enforcement-dependent. If it takes a few more weeks or if it takes months, so be it, he put it. He added, we have to get a great deal that works for the U.S. That is our principal interest. Kudlow added that the U.S. had proposed including in the pact a provision for regular meetings to assess China's implementation of any reforms agreed to. That would include improving treatment of U.S. intellectual property and opening up market access. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and now the weekly feature out of the Kansas Forest Service here at Kansas State University. Tree Tales, and this time with K-State Forester Bob Atchison. Bob?
Tallgrass prairie once covered 170 million acres of North America. Within a generation, the vast majority has been developed or plowed under. Today, less than 4% remains, and most of that is located in the Kansas Flint Hills. Though protection and management of tallgrass prairie is a shared concern among natural resource professionals, a lesser recognized ecosystem also under threat are oak savannas. Oak savannas occur where prairie transitions into forest, and in Kansas, these plant communities were especially prevalent in the historic cross-timber areas in Chautauqua, Elk, Montgomery, Woodson, and Greenwood counties. Healthy oak savannas and the cross-timbers are dominated by herbaceous vegetation and include scattered blackjack and post oak, whose canopy covers between 10 to 25% of the landscape. Like tallgrass prairie, oak savannas are maintained by frequent fire. Because of exclusion of fire, overgrazing, and other disturbances, many oak savannas have now been converted to closed canopy forest. Because oak savannas represent transition zones between forests and prairie, the biodiversity of plant, animal, and bird species that utilize both habitats is much greater. Historically, bison, black bear, bobwhite quail, turkey, deer, rabbits, and passenger pigeons may have used this ecosystem. Today, black-capped vireo and least tern are two endangered species that are found in the region. Research is ongoing to identify plant and animal communities whose populations have been adversely affected by the loss of oak savannas. Landowners interested in restoring oak savannas should consider reintroducing fire periodically, limiting grazing rotations to light or moderate, and direct removal of non-oak species so that canopy cover does not exceed 25% on an acre basis. Reintroduction of native grass and forbs may also be necessary. This is Bob Atchison with the Kansas Forest Service, encouraging you to protect and care for the magnificent natural resources of Kansas. You've been listening to another Tree Tale.
Many thanks, Bob. Have you taken advantage of our podcast service yet? Well, to do so, you can simply go to agtoday.net. That's agtoday.net. You'll find the program there, and if you just tap the subscribe button, brand new episodes of our broadcast will automatically arrive on your device every weekday. Once more, you start by going to agtoday.net. Jeff Wickman is in after the break with this week's 4-H segment. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. True Leaders in Service is a national 4-H community service project created as a way for 4-H members to say thank you to their communities, counties, and states for the support they provide to 4-H. The month-long event officially gets started today and ends with a National 4-H Day of Service the last Saturday of April, which this year falls on the 27th. Southeast Area 4-H Specialist Beth Hinshaw says that Kansas 4-H members will be tackling a variety of projects in their communities this month. Beth, when it comes to the True Leaders in Service, that is something that is at the national level, but something that we do locally.
Exactly. When you hear about True Leaders in Service, you might think about 48 Hours of 4-H, and it's a very similar service challenge, only it's just on the national level.
What we're really trying to do is kind of say thank you to the communities and to our counties and try and work on some projects of interest to that community.
Exactly. We know that young people in the 4-H program have been involved in service for a long time, and we also know how much our communities support our young people in 4-H. So definitely the True Leaders in Service is an opportunity for young people to give back to their community.
What type of things are we looking at doing here? What are some of the service projects that have been done? Because this has been going on for several years now.
The service projects are really all over the board. And it's really all about what is it that your community needs. 4-Hers often are involved in community beautification projects, and certainly April is a really great time for those kinds of things to happen. So we know some of that will happen. We also know that our young people very much care, about the people in their community. So we also see a lot of food drives or drives for personal products, soap, things for laundry, all kinds of things that people may need in your community. Another really popular thing that 4-Hers seem to be involved in is work at animal shelters.
Something that they go in and they do just kind of service work?
Exactly. And like I said, it's really whatever your community needs. So we've had clubs who've gone in and taken toys into the animal shelter that they've made. We've also seen them take blankets in or maybe go in and walk all the dogs. As far as community beautification goes, we've seen lots of raking and planting and painting, those kinds of things. Community service is something that we have been learning a lot about, and it's part of our 8 critical elements. It allows young people to develop a sense of pride and ownership in their community, and it also allows youth and adults to work together while helping others. There are wonderful community partnerships all across our state for 4-H, and those same kind of folks, they're interested in what's going on in the community as well. So some of those organizations might be their county commissioners, their extension board, maybe some of those community service clubs, the Master Gardeners, Chamber of Commerce, or the school district. There's just all kinds of groups out there that are also going to see the need for some service happening in the community.
So hopefully they have been kind of planning this and have a good game plan heading into this, I guess, what is really the last Saturday in April?
It is scheduled for the last Saturday in April, but what the National 4-H program says is, whatever service you can do during April. So it could happen that last Saturday, but if it's more convenient to happen another time, that's great as well. And that last Saturday is kind of a national day of service that not just 4-H is working on. And, National Volunteer Week is during April as well. So it's kind of an opportunity for all these things to come together.
This is really part of the leadership portion of 4-H?
Definitely. And, when we think about our pledge, we pledge to our community. And so, yes, it's definitely part of the leadership, but it's also part of the citizenship piece or that giving back piece.
You would also like to know what the groups or individuals are doing or what they're at least planning to do?
Yes, and National has a very similar format to what we have, and that is that they'd like you to register your projects so they know where those are going on, and then afterward they would like for you to go in and report on what you did. And certainly on the state level, we would love to know that as well. And so we know how important social media is, and so there's lots of options for people to either, put photos and information on their Facebook page for their club or to tweet those photos, but we're excited to see what happens.
And this is something that the clubs decide on themselves, each individual club, or sometimes clubs go together?
Exactly. Especially like when we think about 48 hours of 4-H, and I would assume it will be similar for True Leaders in Service, is sometimes a club has a project, sometimes a county or district has a county-wide or a district-wide project, or maybe it's just a project group that has a project that they're going to do. Doesn't matter. Any group, 4-H club or group, is welcome to take part.
And this is not something that has to be a day-long event. This is just tackling a project.
Exactly. It's just tackling something. And so, yes, if it's something that takes a day, great. But if it's something that, takes a couple hours, that's fine as well. And we know that a lot of good can be done in just a short amount of time.
And this is also a way for 4-H members to get friends and maybe non-4-H members involved.
One of the things that we say about 4-H is, we want you to inspire kids to do. And when we have opportunities like this for young people to be involved in service and young people to have a hands-on experience that very much inspires kids to do things. And so, yes, not only for our 4-H'ers, but it is a great way to introduce others to the 4-H program.
If people want to find out more about being involved with this activity, how can they do that?
I've actually put a link on our Kansas 4-H webpage. That's at www.kansas4h.org, and it's down under What's Hot. And so if you click on that, that'll take you to the National 4-H site with the planning guide, and there's a risk management template, there's media information, all kinds of, really just everything that you need to plan your project.
And like you said, once you get that project planned and once you're out there doing the project, make sure you share what you're doing.
Most definitely. We want to see it.
That's Southeast Area 4-H Specialist Beth Hinshaw. Again, for more information on True Leaders in Service, go to kansas4h.org or contact the local extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.